This is the story of my Powermatic 180 planer. I got this planer at the very first live auction that I had ever gone to. I had seen that this planer was there, but I already had a 16-inch planer, and I really didn't need this planer. So I hadn't even looked at the planer or inspected it or seen whether it was in good shape or not. But it came up on the auction, and it was moving along through the auction, and it got to about $400, and it started to sound like it was going to sell at that price. And to me, that seemed like a ridiculously good deal for a planer like this. So I raised my number, and I figured it would keep going on the price. And the next thing I knew, the auctioneer was looking at me saying, "Sold, 450." So in about 10 seconds, I went from not even thinking about this planer to owning it and having to deal with getting it home. I got it around the time I was building the shop, so it had to wait in the carport for a little while. And then on move-in day into the shop, I could move it in with the rest of the tools. Now, in inspecting it and cleaning it up, I found that it had this interesting cutter head that I had never seen before. It's called a quiet head. It's something that Powermatic made for a few years in the 80s. And it's similar to a straight knife cutter head, but it's got a whole bunch, I think 27 little short 2.5-inch blades. And it works fine, but it's kind of a pain to sharpen, as you've got all these little short blades. So really the only way to sharpen this cutter head is to have the grinder that sharpens the cutter head in place. Now the planer came with the bar that holds the sharpening grinder, but it didn't come with the actual grinder, so I had to track one of those down. And I used the planer and sharpened it with this grinding attachment for the last, I guess, 7 years I've had it. Now, a few of these little blades that are in the quiet head are clearly right at the end of their lifespan. So either I try and track down new blades, or I just replace the cutter head. And it seemed like replacing the cutter head to something more standard would be the easier and sort of better thing to do. So I finally managed to track down a straight knife cutter head, which actually isn't too hard because a lot of people are replacing the straight knife heads with Shelix carbide insert heads. And I sort of figured I would get a cheap old straight knife head to practice changing out the cutter head on this planer before I go and splurge on a carbide insert head for it. So the straight knifed standard head that I got for it seemed to be complete and in good shape, and it came with a lot of blades, which is good. So that sat for a few months while I found the time to actually change the cutter head out on the planer. Now, if you're really going to change the cutter head out on your Powermatic planer, there's a series of really good videos on how to do that. So I'll put a link to those down in the description. I'll just kind of do an overview of what I did to change the head. So I pulled off all the bits on the top, the grinding bar and the dust collection hood. And I cleaned out as much of the wood chips as I could. And I took all the belt covers off. Actually, changing the cutter head isn't that hard. What's difficult is you need to take so much of the planer apart to get at the cutter heads. So the pressure bar has to come off. And the chip breaker has to come off. And none of it's very difficult. It's just keeping track of all the little nuts and bolts and all the different parts that are coming off. Now I can take the belts off the drive side of the cutter head. So this will let me take the indexing pin and the pulley off the drive side of the cutter head. Now none of the parts that I'm taking out are pressed fit, so nothing's super tight. It's all slip fit. But as these have been in place for 40 years or so, they need a little bit of extra to get them off. I'm using pullers in a lot of places to get the gears and the pulleys off. Now I can work on the other side of the planer. And these are all of the gears and pulleys that transfer the rotation of the cutter head into the slower rotation of the infeed and outfeed rollers. And I need to take a lot of this apart to be able to push on the cutter head and push it out of the drive side of the planer. These two big gears had to come off. The first one came off easily, and the second one was a little bit more of a problem in that it didn't seem to be moving as I put pressure on the puller, and I really didn't want to break a tooth on the gear. So I sprayed it with a little penetrating oil and let it sit for a while. Then came back and very carefully turned the puller. And right here, I could feel it start to give. And after that, I knew that the gear was coming off the shaft and not going to break a tooth on the gear. Now I can take the bar at the end of the cutter head off, and I can pull the belt off. It was at about this point I realized I could get new belts because I was going to have all of this apart. And these belts were starting to look a little old. Some of them had the green paint on them, like they're the original belts for the planer. Now I can take the little pulley off the end of the cutter head off, and this came off really easily. Now all of this is so I can get to the end of the cutter head and attach a puller to the planer and use it to push the cutter head out. Now the bearings inside the bearing housing that I'm pushing out at this point are just a slip fit and aren't in there really tight, but they need a little help to come out. So one side I'm pushing the bearing out, and one side, the drive side, I'm pushing the bearing and the bearing housing out of the frame. Then I can pull the bearing housing off while it's sitting on the bench. Now I cleaned up and re-greased all of the different places where things connect, or where things are supposed to slip together. So this is the bearing housing on the non-drive side. And I can put the new cutter head in. This is really the point of this whole thing. And I had to keep track of the different supports for the chip breaker and the pressure bar. Make sure they were put on right side up and in the right order. Now I tapped all of that in, mostly to get the bearing into the non-drive side. And I put the little pulley back on the end. It took a little convincing. Now the indexer pin holds the bearing housing to the frame on the drive side. And it's basically back in at this point. Many of the keys had been tightened into place so securely with the set screw that they were actually damaged a little bit. So I ground those down so they would slide within their keyway. This might have been some of why things were hard to get apart. So all of the different gears and pulleys went back on with a little tapping, but went back on easily. The drive pulley wanted to be a certain place on the shaft. I had measured where that was before I took it off. And once that was about right, I could tighten up the set screw. Now, once that was in place, I could clean up the cutter head. It had a very light layer of rust on it. And I didn't want to take off so much that I would change the mass of the cutter head. So I hit it with a wire brush and I sanded it with 1000 grit sandpaper. And this really wasn't necessary. It just kind of made the cutter head look a little better. And I can clean up the oil with acetone. And I can put the belts back on. And I could put new belts back on the non-drive side. Luckily, these belts were all standard sizes, so it wasn't hard to find new belts. I can put the little bar back on, and I can put the two big gears back on. So these gears go to the infeed and the outfeed roller. And the last pulley and the last belt can go on. Now the whole lower section of this setup can be moved up and down to tighten that belt. Now there's a little clutch mechanism that allows you to turn the feed rollers on and off, and that's what this is. And I had measured where it was supposed to go, and that ended up not even being close. I had to adjust that when I was putting the cover back on. Now it's time to put the blades in. So I cleaned up the gib bars, getting the little bit of surface rust off. And I can put all the bolts back in. Now the little height adjustment pins go in. And then the blade and the gib bar kind of sandwiched together. They fit into a slot in the cutter head. And the little bolts kind of work in reverse to the way a bolt would normally work, in that they push against the side of the slot and hold the blade in place. Now I didn't have the little gauge to set the height of the blades, but I figured I could make one. So I cut out a shape that would fit around the curve of the cutter head and give me a spot to put a bolt into that piece to be able to set the height of the knives. So the actual height isn't that important. What's important is that the blades are all the same. If you've got one blade that's too low, it won't really be doing anything. And if you've got one blade that's too high, that blade will be doing all the work. So you really want the blades to all be the same. So I can put a threaded insert into that piece and put a bolt into that. Then I can use that to make sure the tip of the blade is the same distance from the cutter head at both ends and from blade to blade. There's 3 blades in this cutter head, which is a lot better than 27. And I also figured out that when you're running the grinding wheel to sharpen the blades, the grinding wheel really doesn't take off that much. So you really can't re-even out the blades if you haven't got them really close to the same all the way across. So I had the bolts just tight enough to hold the blades in place, but they could still move. And once I had them all set to the right height, I could then tighten everything up. And it sounds like you want to do each blade a little bit and then move to the next blade and tighten that one up and kind of go around and around. If you do that, the cutter head will stay balanced and won't be deformed. Now I can put the chip breaker back on. And I can put the pressure bar back on. And the pressure bar has some adjustment screws. And I can run it and see if it works. Now this little hand wheel that I'm turning adjusts the speed of the infeed and outfeed rollers. So you can set it to plane slowly and give you a better surface, or plane quickly and not give you quite as good a surface. Now it's time to sharpen the blades. So I can put the grinding bar back on. Now it wasn't going back and forth real easily, so I cleaned up and greased the threaded rod, and that helped a little, but what ended up really helping was putting whey oil on the wheys. I think that's really the key. Now I wanted to check and make sure the grinding bar was parallel to the cutter head, and on my first test it was off by about 6/1000ths of an inch. I think I'm reading this right. And there's a little adjustment bolt on the end of the grinding bar that allows you to adjust that. So I was able to get it within 1/1000th of an inch, which I think is close enough. Now I can put the grinding wheel on. Now I'd hoped my little indexing wheel at the end of the cutter head was going to be in the right place, but it really wasn't. So I had to adjust that, and I kind of eyeballed the angle, which I hope is close enough. And I don't seem to have the indexing pin that allows you to do two different angles on the edge of the blade. So for now, I'm just doing one angle, and I kind of see how that's hard on the grinding wheel, trying to take off that much surface area, as I had to go over this quite a few times to get all the blades the same and even. So I think next time I may try and do two bevels on the edge of the blades, just by moving my indexing ring. And I also don't have the honing stone, so I'm not able to do that at this point. Although the planer seems to work fine the way I've done it. But you can see it took quite a bit of sharpening. So once that was done, I could put the dust collection back on. And I could put the covers over the belts. Now, when I ran it the first time, it wasn't really planing as well as I'd hoped. So I went through and adjusted the pressure bar and the chip breaker. Mostly the pressure bar, that's kind of the most important one. That's the bar that holds the wood down after it's passed under the cutter head. And that seemed to help. Also, I think the first piece of wood I put through was just a 2x4, so it didn't plane real well. So then I planed a piece of maple, and that worked really well. So it seems to be in good working order now. So that's the planer, and hopefully it will continue to work well. Thanks for watching.